On September 10th, 2025, Charlie Kirk was assassinated. What followed couldn't be ignored. No matter what you thought about him, or if you ever thought of him at all, he was everywhere. The memes were abundant. Comment sections were flooded.
One of those messages found on one of the unspent cartridges said, "Hey, fascist, catch."
What we just seen was an example of Kirkification.
Constantly keep seeing on my feed the Kirk machine, Kirk Bartolozzi, Kirk Lotta Red.
Kirk was a polarizing figure, so this was expected. From his hard right-leaning campus visits and abrasive personal opinions, tensions were high when he was around, especially if you didn't agree with him. Despite his intensity, or perhaps because of it, he had a massive following who publicly mourned his death. From one moment to the next, the whiplash of Kirk's murder was felt across political divides.
My husband, Charlie, wanted to save young men, just like the one who took his life.
How do you feel?
Happy. That's good. Girl, someone had to do it.
And we take comfort in the knowledge that he is now at peace with God in heaven.
Calling this nation to honor the man who was an unapologetic racist, sowing seeds of division and hate into this land.
Some people showed grief, others were vengeful, full of resentment. But there was also joy and celebration. It was really hard to keep up. But politics have always been divisive. I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, said Evelyn Beatrice Hall. When Trump was shot at, twice, the right to free speech took on a whole new level. People's careers ended because of their public reaction. Yet, we skip over obituaries to get to the wordle, the reverence we express for some deaths, while others go ignored. How can we make sense of that? Why is that? How do we decide who and how to mourn? Who gets RIP posts on socials, and who is only talked about via direct message? Who gets publicly acknowledged, and who is only talked about in whispers? So what about when it's time to grieve and you just don't feel it? Or maybe your grief feels more like bubbling laughter or violent rage. What then? Are there right and wrong ways to grieve, especially when doing it publicly, like on social media, at funerals, or social settings? I guess the question I'm really asking here is, what if someone you not only didn't know personally, but after learning about them, decided you're kinda happy they're gone? Someone you hate dies. What now? Welcome to Someone You Hate Dies. What Now? I'm your host, Saturn Steel-Mendez. What is public mourning when you feel pressured to show grief that you don't feel? What is it if you genuinely mourn your abuser's death? How does society at large perform its grief? Does it make sense that this is so confusing? Most of the time, death is depicted in media as highly dramatic, sensationalized, hyperbolic, extremist, nihilistic, or experienced in a corrupted environment. It often looks like crying, breaking down, curling up in a bed for days, enacting revenge. But this is not the whole story. We see the immediate and rarely stick around for the messy aftermath. The more we can recognize the grief in all of us, the better equipped we can be to support those we love. This takes us to the Good Morning Festival, an annual festival hosted by Evergreen Brickworks that celebrates public mourning as a special part of life, rather than hiding our grief, as we usually do. Evergreen Brickworks is an NGO that specializes in the transformation of spaces for the betterment of people and the planet. Within the last few years, they developed their annual Day of the Dead celebration into a second-day affair for a wider community. Many organizations contribute to the festival in volunteer partnerships with Evergreen Brickworks, such as Space for Grief and Bereaved Families of Ontario. These organizations offer free interactive installations, therapy sessions, educational materials, and more. and I was lucky enough to bump into Sarah Garcia-Heller, the executive director of Bereaved Families of Toronto.
So Bereaved Families has been around since 1978, providing peer-based grief support to Torontonians, those that have had loved ones die of any age, 6 and up. And we also train volunteers. This is our second year being involved in the Good Mourning Festival. We're quite honored to be asked to come back. Being asked back this year has been really meaningful. We've been able to provide peer-based support groups and also one-to-one support, as well as tabling at this event. So we're very happy to be back.
You talked a little bit about the group and its and how you got involved and how that's been really meaningful, and because you volunteered to begin with. Can you talk to me a little bit about its place in your life in relationship to grief and healing, as well as just the kind of general space that this particular role fills in your life?
Before I had my own personal loss, I was on a completely different path in terms of life. So being connected to Bereaved Families of Toronto made a huge difference. Having lived through loss, I was quite young. As a bereaved mom, I was in my mid-20s and hadn't connected to anybody else in my age group with that loss. So it meant everything to be surrounded by peers, to normalize the loss, to normalize the pain and how hard it was, how overwhelming it felt. And it changed my entire life, my involvement with Bereaved Families of Toronto. It normalized something that felt really scary for me to even talk about or deal with. And now I have these conversations day to day with everybody. You know, really, death and grief and emotional literacy is a huge part of what we do and what we offer, and offering a safe space for others. And that's our main focus. And so it has completely changed my life and the person that I am in general, how I move through the world, how I understand others might need support, and also empathy. It brings an element of empathy that without going through loss yourself, you just don't get.
For sure. That.
Yeah.
And then can you talk to me a little bit about the taboo nature of grief in our society and how it is typically something that we don't talk about, at least in our sort of more surface level relationships, and maybe any suggested alternatives for talking about grief?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in North American society, we don't talk a lot about grief or death. There's a lot of cultures around the world that embrace it, that talk about it. It's part of day-to-day life. It's part of their reality. Here in Canada, in Toronto, not so much, which is why the Good Mourning Festival is so, so important. But I would say that, you know, this taboo thing of grief, really just bringing it to light and realizing that this is a lived experience that everybody shares. And when we're quiet about it and we don't talk about it, we feel alone. And the second we start to share, all of a sudden you meet 10 other people that can empathize and understand with your situation. It may not be the exact same loss, or it can. I've met tons of bereaved parents, you know, people that have approached me all of a sudden because they've heard my story and they want to share their own. But having that open conversation, it just takes one person to kind of start that in our society at large, you know, in our social circles. And so not being afraid to say, hey, I've been through something terrible, devastating, life-changing, can make all the difference to someone else. And the conversation just starts, and that connection just starts. So while it is taboo here a lot, I find that there's been so much change over the last few years with social media, with peer-based support groups like BFO Toronto. You know, people are getting more and more comfortable with talking about their grief, not just due to death, but the grief that they experience in life day to day. And so offering that environment for someone is so important in that year. So, you know, with an initial loss, there's always secondary losses that come, right? For example, if you're a spouse that has all of a sudden lost their partner, grief comes in all forms. It's not just missing that person, but you may have lost an income. You may have lost a job. You miss that parent being around to support your children if you have them. There are tons of losses that come after an initial death or loss. It can be social circle, right? A lot of people don't know how to talk and support others. And so you become more and more uncomfortable and more isolated because people don't know how to talk to you. They don't know how to approach you, how to deal with you. They're scared of saying the wrong thing. So there are tons of losses that can come out of that initial loss. There's also just disenfranchised grief in general. You know, those losses that aren't recognized by society aren't considered legitimate. Child loss can be one of them, pregnancy loss another, homicide, death due to overdose. All these losses that as a society we're really uncomfortable about confronting and talking about because we're scared of saying the wrong thing and we're scared of hurting someone even more.
That was Sarah Garcia-Heller from Bereaved Families of Toronto. In my conversation with Sarah, she brought up a lot of really interesting points, like the notion that connectivity and sharing really is the basis of destigmatizing public grieving. Went from feeling totally alone in her grief, feeling completely isolated. She felt like it was just her and her grief, her and the absence of her daughter. But really, there was so much there. She just needed someone to see her, feel her, hear her, recognize in her the kind of grief that we all carry, the kind of grief that looks like losing someone, or losing something you care about, or losing part of yourself. Grief is really heavy. Sharing it with someone else, someone who can understand some of what you're going through, can make a huge difference. Even if it takes just a little bit of weight off, that can be enough. Not being scared to ask a grieving person questions or simply letting them talk can make something so largely taboo less difficult to accept and discuss, which is really what this entire festival is about and why our podcast was so lucky to be a part of it. Next, we'll be hearing from Carolyn Smith. She's a social worker and therapist based out of Toronto who specializes in grieving.
Bereavement is really, the period of time in which we are, perceived to be grieving and mourning. And then mourning is that outward expression. So we can experience grief about, realizing there's something we never had in our childhood, or we can experience grief about losing a job or whatever. It's really quite broad. It doesn't just specifically apply to a death. Whereas bereavement and mourning, I would say, are more specific to death.
We don't have a social way, I find, of honoring public mourning in this particular way. I think that the closest that we generally get would be like a celebration of life, which is typically very short and very rushed and very expensive.
So some of the things that are coming up for me and thinking about what has helped clients and also historically, some examples that I could speak to are, the old habit of wearing a black armband during a period of mourning. Right? Or the wearing of black clothes. That's pretty much disappeared. But the number of times I talk with clients who are like, yeah, you go off on bereavement leave for a while, but then you come back to work and geez, wouldn't it be nice to just have some way to signify to people, yeah, I'm still in mourning. Like that could be something you could take on or off to have your grief recognized. Another secular way we do grief that I actually think is highly successful are grief groups. I mean, I think grief groups are fantastic. And not all grief groups turn out to cohere that well. But some of them do, and it's really quite magical. The ones that really stood out to me were, we'd almost have them act out or play out or create materials around the funerals that they had attended. And they would almost compete to see what would be the best funeral. Like, it was incredible how open they were to talking about it. And another thing that comes up is, I hear a lot of people getting really creative around the funerals themselves or the celebration of life. So, in addition to doing like the slideshow and the speeches and whatever, really creating space either online or by people bringing in mementos or stories that get documented so that they have a way or a place to continue the mourning after the event. And I think that's super cool. So there's a lot actually happening online in that regard as well. So the continuing bonds theory says that we have a relationship with people in life and we continue to have a relationship with them in death. And if we do it well, that person becomes a source of continued learning, continued relating, etc. For some people, they can still sort of internally ask a question of the person they've lost, and the answer will just sort of magically appear. In fact, what we now understand is we're trying to transition people to this state of continuing bonds. So, the first thing that always came up for me around that is, well, what if the person that you were relating to wasn't a good person? Right? What if they were hurtful or harmful to you in some way? And so some of the work we do there is around recognizing that we can connect with the highest and best. The person can't hurt us anymore, but we can connect with what was their highest and best self, the things that were good about them, and carry those things forward. So I love the theory of continuing bonds because it gives us an amazing way to not have to let go fully of people who died, because psychologically that's really hard for people to do.
Can we take 5 steps back, and can you define grief for me and mourning, and how you may or may not use them as synonyms for one another, and also what you have found has been the perfect recipe, I use that loosely, for moving through these feelings of grief and or mourning?
There's 3. It's grief, bereavement, and mourning. Those are the 3. We tend to use them colloquially somewhat interchangeably, but grief really is the emotional response to loss.
It's absolutely vital that we understand grief from a psychological standpoint, to understand the trajectory of grief and how it looks different for everybody. And it's often not short, it's often not measured, and it's often very unpredictable. Group therapy and open conversations are so important because they can turn funerals into celebrations of life, and celebrations of life into things like the Good Morning Festival. It's a new perspective on dying that can sometimes help with the pain and often help with the loneliness. So let's just step back for a second. What was our original question? Why are we here? Why are we talking about dying? Someone you hate dies. What now? Through the passing of public figures, we've seen that the first step is usually outrage, anger, sadness. Sometimes that leads to violence. These are all reactions we've seen take place when it comes to public grieving, like with Charlie Kirk. But if we took our guest's advice and started to accept that grief is here and grieving begins with sharing, forming connections, asking questions. If we understood that a relationship that started in life can continue in death, that someone dead isn't just gone from your life, then maybe these radical reactions, maybe they could be avoided. There's no right or wrong way to grieve, and I most certainly am not here to tell you how you should feel when someone passes. But we, as a society, can take steps to destigmatize grief and eradicate this notion that it's something that we should only do alone, that it's always going to be a terrifying, heart-wrenching experience. Public mourning can simply be a conversation, a check-in with a friend, a celebration of life post. What public mourning means to you is yours, and yours alone. Grief can be beautiful and healing, but it's up to us to make that choice. Together. For JRN 403, I'm Saturn Steel-Mendez. Someone You Hate Dies, What Now? Was produced by Chris Choe, Maia-Anne Erikson, and me, Script written by Maya with help from Chris, also help from me. Script edited by yours truly, and our audio editor is Chris Choe.